This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Hi, Keith. How are you this evening?
Good.
Good. So we are in chapter 13. Here in the middle of the chapter, I had 13 verse 14, I think is where we left off last time. So in this whole section of the Gospel of Mark, we've been following Jesus since the beginning, as Mark introduces Jesus as the Son of God and the Messiah. He comes on the scene proclaiming that the kingdom of God is near, and then he demonstrates how the kingdom of God is near as he drives out unclean spirits, as he brings healing, as he forgives sins, as he proclaims the word through his parables and his teaching. We see that throughout that, his disciples often misunderstand who he is, and those who try to point out his identity as the Messiah are often instructed not to reveal that Jesus has this motif throughout the first portion of the Gospel of Mark, where he does not really reveal his status as the Messiah. Then we have that turning point in chapter 8. Jesus is talking to his disciples as they're on the road, and he says, who do you say that I am? After they gave a couple different options of who people were saying he was one of the prophets, maybe Elijah or John the Baptist. And Peter says, you are the Christ. And again, Jesus says, don't tell anyone. But then he goes into these predictions, and he has 3 of these predictions where he tells that the Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem, be mocked and beaten and killed, and then rise again. And all 3 times that he gives those predictions, the disciples show that they don't understand the nature of his kingdom. But Jesus continues to teach them that the kingdom is about the cross and taking up a cross, and the kingdom is about service, and the greatest will be the one who serves. So he continues that teaching. And finally, then, after those predictions, that teaching in chapter 11, he arrives in Jerusalem, which has been their destination as they've been on the road. He is welcomed in that journey into the city with the shouts of Hosanna and blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, clearly kind of indicating that the crowds believed that he was going to bring some sort of political or even maybe some sort of a coup or upheaval in the capital city of Jerusalem. And so with that expectation, though, he goes into the temple and into Jerusalem and the temple. He looks around and then he walks out. He comes back the next day. On the way, he curses this fig tree that doesn't have because it doesn't have any fruit for him. And then he goes into the temple. He basically shuts the temple down. He comes back that evening and leaves the city, and when you're coming back in the next day, they see that the fig tree has indeed been cursed. What Jesus said the day before happened, and that fig tree becomes kind of this sign. The temple wasn't bearing fruit, and so it too has been shut down by Jesus because it wasn't fulfilling its intended purpose. Just as the fig tree wasn't providing fruit, neither was the temple. Jesus then goes into several conflicts and confrontations with Jewish religious leaders. So the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, all these groups. And in each time he gets into these different debates with them, and he kind of, even as they're trying to trap him, one-ups them and silences them one by one. All of those are silenced until one scribe comes and talks about what the greatest commandment is, the first one. And Jesus says 2, actually. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. And so love God, love neighbor is the essence for Jesus of the law. And that scribe then, who says, hey, that's great, you're right, because sacrifices aren't as important as loving our neighbor and loving God. And so that guy got close, and that's when now Jesus goes back. He's at the temple. He's been at the temple the whole time. He's at the temple. He's witnessing the offerings. He's denounced the scribes for the way that they treat widows. And then he sees a poor widow come and put her offering in. And he indicates that she contributed more than anyone else. That takes us then to chapter 13. After 2 chapters, they're leaving the temple. And as they're coming out, the disciples say, "Oh, man, what large stones, what large buildings." They're in awe of the temple. And then Jesus asked, "Hey, you see those buildings? Not one stone's going to be left. It's all going to come down. It's all going to be destroyed." And then he's sitting on the Mount of Olives. His disciples, 4 of them, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, ask him, in essence, 2 questions. When will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished? So when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished? Jesus then goes into a discourse where he answers that. And so it's when this is taking place that we're on basically on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. He's instructing them, and he begins to tell them about persecutions that's going to come, and basically that this is going to be a time when there's wars and rumors of wars. We're going to have a lot of people coming and trying to say that they are the Messiah, but all of these things are signs that it's the beginning, but it's not the end. This is just the beginning of birth pains, he says. What will happen is that ultimately the gospel will be preached to all nations. That's in verse 10, that the good news must be proclaimed to all nations. There's going to be trials. There's going to be hardships. They're going to have to endure suffering. But those who endure will be saved, he says. So those who undergo suffering and remain faithful amidst it, those who undergo persecution and remain faithful, they will be saved. And so what Jesus looks like it's talking about in the first half, so from basically, we would say from verses 5 down to verse 23, and we're going to see some of that tonight, is that Jesus is referencing kind of the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the temple. Then in verse 24, he's going to take a little bit of a shift, and it's going to say, after all that, then there's going to be ultimately the end. And basically, it's kind of the end of the world as we know it. So it's the end of Jerusalem, and then the end of the world as we know it. And we then, and the readers of Mark's gospel, are going to find ourselves in this in-between time, in between the destruction of Jerusalem and the end before the coming of the Son of Man. So that's kind of where we're at. And this first section is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem, first century. Then he's going to go at the end of the chapter to the end of the world. And we're going to learn how do we live in the midst of this in-between time as we are living as readers of Mark's gospel in between the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the end of the world and the signs of the coming of the Son of Man. So that's kind of just the outline of this chapter. So verse 14 gets interesting. Let's read 14 through 23. If someone other than Martha would read that.
I will.
I'll read it.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
Go ahead.
Helen, was that Helen?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Helen.
But when you see the abomination of desolation usurping a place which is not his, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must take to the hills. If anyone is on the roof, he must not go down into the house to fetch anything out. If anyone is in the field, he must not turn back for his coat. Alas for a woman with child in those days, and for those who have children at the breast. Pray that it may not come in winter, for those days will bring distress such as there has never been before, since the beginning of the world which God created and will never be again. If the Lord had not cut short that time of troubles, no living thing could survive. However, no living thing could survive. However, for the sake of his own, whom he has chosen, he has cut short the time. If anyone says to them, "Look, here is the Messiah," or "Look, there he is," do not believe it. Impostors will come claiming to be messiahs or prophets, and they will produce signs and wonders to mislead, if possible, God's chosen. Be on your guard. I have forewarned you of it all.
All right, thank you, Helen. So this kind of in verse 7, we're told that there's going to be the wars and rumors of wars, and this kind of further gives us kind of a detailed explanation of some of what that period will look like. There's two things that are very interesting in verse 14. Is we have this idea called the desolating sacrilege. Or what other translations do you have of the desolating sacrilege? Abomination, maybe?
Abomination of desolation.
The abomination of desolation. That's probably the other most common translation. So this looks back at an Old Testament, so it's an allusion to something that is talked about in the book of Daniel, and also an intertestamental event. So let's talk about that in a second. But then the other thing we have here is Mark actually makes a direct statement, and a lot of translations will put it in parentheses or something, to his readers, that in the midst of Jesus's teaching in this whole chapter, which if you have one of the old red letter editions, this is all red letters except that little section where it says, "Let the reader understand." It's like, I kind of think of it as Mark winking at the people reading his gospel that, you know what I'm talking about. You know what this is. What's hard is, as people that don't live in the first century, it's a little bit harder for us sometimes to figure out exactly what he's talking about. And so we'll try to figure out if we can. But he kind of gives them a thing like, you understand, you know what I'm talking about. So the desolating sacrilege, where it ought not to be. So this event is talked about in Daniel chapter 9 and 11 and 12. And you might remember back, was it a couple years ago, we when we studied the book of Daniel, we talked a little bit about this abomination that causes desolation. And this desolating sacrilege seems to be a person, doesn't it? It says, you see the desolating sacrilege standing. Some translations say where it ought not to be, but it could also be translated where he ought not to be. So it seems to be that it's probably referencing a person, although it could reference an item.
Mm-hmm.
But the historical background in First Maccabees, which is a book that is intertestamental book that was written in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, talks about an event that seems to be at least some of what a fulfillment of what Daniel was talking about. And that was in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus Epiphanes is one of the kind of governors and of the regions that were separated in these 4 territories after Alexander the Great. And he is over the area of Syria, and he went and fought down in Egypt and fought against one of the other generals there who had been given leadership over a certain area. And when he's coming back from that victory in Egypt in about 168 BC, he comes into Jerusalem and he stops all the sacrifices in the Jerusalem temple. He burned the copies of the law. He orders that the observance of the law should cease. He sets up a pagan altar and he offers a sacrifice there to the god Zeus. And so it seems to be that there was this act that was, I think, a one level fulfillment of Daniel. I also think Daniel has a deeper level fulfillment. And I think that there's a couple possibilities for what this desolating sacrilege could talk about. Many scholars think that Mark might be talking about when the temple and Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD, that the Roman general Titus, he comes into the temple, plants the Roman standard, and he begins doing all these idolatrous actions and all these kind of false sacrifices in the temple as well. So I think when he's talking about let the reader understand, that he might be talking about those acts that had to do with this period. I think that the fact that it is this period is also told by this idea of fleeing Judea. We see that in verse 14, that when this happens, that those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And you get all this stuff that if you're praying or resting, if you're working on the roof of your house, whatever you're doing, don't take time to go back home. Don't take time to go re-enter your house. Don't worry about selecting what you need to flee. What's called for is immediate departure. And that's kind of what happened when Jerusalem was destroyed. And it was over a kind of a 4-year period in that time period. But basically, as the Romans come in, the people began to flee, and many Christians did flee during that time. And so you must depart directly, Jesus says, from your present location. Just like the same way in which Lot, you remember in the Old Testament, Genesis 19, when Lot fled with his family from the city of Sodom at its destruction. That's the same way. You got to be ready to go at a moment's notice. It's going to be happening. And this is going to be difficult. The haste and being ready to go at a moment's notice is especially going to be difficult. For who in particular does he talk about there in verse 17?
Mothers.
Yeah, the pregnant ones and then those nursing. So if you're at that stage of life, it's going to be particularly difficult. And then you also are going to pray. You don't want it to happen in what season?
Winter.
Winter. Because winter is going to be a time when you have the rain, the cold winds, all the things that come with that, the muddy tracks, the swollen streams. And those days, Jesus says, are going to be days of suffering in verse 19. Suffering such has not been from the beginning of the creation that God has created until now, and never will be. But verse 20 says that those days won't last forever. So this is not going to be something that goes on. God is going to end it. And why does he end it?
For the sake of his chosen or his elect.
For the sake of the elect. So the idea here is that this is just because there's suffering and there's trials and there's tribulation and all this fleeing and the wars and all that, God's care doesn't end for his people. He's still looking out for his people. And so he's going to bring an end. He's going to shorten those days. If this would allow to go on forever, everything would have been destroyed. But God doesn't allow that to happen. It will come to an end. And it's all, the other part of that is saying this is all God's allowing this to happen. This is all within his plan and his purposes, that this is not something that is taking God unaware, that you shouldn't be concerned that, oh, God's lost control. No, God is the one who is allowing this to happen, and he will cut it short, and he'll do it for the sake of his elect. And then he says, if anyone says to you at that time, look, here's the Messiah, look, there he is, don't believe it. There's going to be all these false prophets and false messiahs that come around, and they're going to actually maybe do some things that seem to be maybe miraculous signs and omens, and you're going to hear all these rumors about stuff that they do. They're going to try to lead the elect astray. They're going to try to lead God's chosen people astray. but don't be misled. This is returning to the theme. He already talked about that theme back in verses 5 and 6 about many will come and say, I am he, and will lead many astray. So he's just kind of reiterating again that this is what's going to happen. But in the midst of that, what is called for is alertness. Look at verse 23. Be alert. Basically, be on guard. You're going to have people that are going to try to lead you astray. You're going to have all these things that are going to happen, and these wars and the turmoils, and your job is to be alert, to be on guard. Some translations say take heed. And don't forget that I've already told you this. This is going to happen. Be ready. So the state of readiness is constantly called for. And so remember here, this is Jesus answering the disciples' question. When's this going to take place? It's interesting that he never actually says when. But one thing is that for Mark's readers, that's most likely not the question, because a lot of scholars, and I believe that Mark was written at a time when so Jesus predicted this before it happened, but that this happened in and Jesus's disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they would have lived through this period when this destruction of the temple happens. And so for them, it will have happened. And the question isn't when, the question is, okay, now that that's happened, how do we live? And the key is that you don't listen to anybody that says this is the end of time. You don't listen to anyone that says, okay, now that that happened, this is the automatically going to be, okay, the Son of Man's coming right now. Because what has to happen first is that the gospel has to go forth. The commitment to mission is going to happen. Yes, there's going to be persecution. Yes, there will be suffering, but the mission will continue and the mission will go on. And so be alert and be ready, be on guard against all those false people, but the mission will continue. The gospel will continue to go forth and be preached. And so that's the message. Don't listen to anyone that says this is it, it's over. This is just the beginning, but now we got to go on and continue to preach the gospel. And that's where he's pointing his disciples. Questions or observations so far? All right, let's look at so verse 24 to 37. So this will be the second half of that chapter. If someone could read that.
I'll do that.
Thank you, Susan.
Mhm. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near, at the very doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when that time is. It is like a man going to a far country, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to each his work. and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch.
So there's thank you, Susan. So there's a big switch here in verse 24. The first thing is what's the first word of verse 24?
But
So we have a but, and so there's this but, so we have a contrast. So, but in those days, after that suffering, so this is after the suffering that he's talked about in the first part. So this is separate from that. It's after that. Then we're going to see things that happen. So remember the questions that the disciples asked at the beginning of the chapter. First question was when. He's going to continue to deal with that some. The other question was, what are the signs that all of these things will be accomplished? So the when was immediately in reference to the destruction of the temple, but then there's also these signs that all these things are to be accomplished. And so what we have is this switch that the first half is dealing more with the destruction of Jerusalem itself. This next part is kind of the end of the world, that the end of the world as we know it. I mean, is the way maybe to put it the best. It's not the total end of everything, because God is going to make it all new, but it's the end of the way in which it has continued to go. And so we're going to see all kinds of signs. He talks about those signs. So in those days after that suffering, you're going to have all these visual things, right? The sun is going to be darkened. The moon doesn't give light. The stars will fall. The powers in the heavens will be shaken. All these things, if you might notice in your translations, if they indicate that those verses are actually from the Old Testament, Jesus is referencing there and citing Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10 and Isaiah 34:4. In Isaiah, those are verses that describe the wrath which will overtake the world on the day of the Lord, that is both ironically the day of judgment, but also the day of God's salvation. So it's both, and that continues here in the New Testament, that the day of the Lord is both a day of judgment, but also a day of salvation, and we see that in this passage as well. With those quotes, notice this in verse 26. So if you have a contrast here, look at verse 14. And just the first phrase there. And then you look at verse 26. What do you notice about the pronouns here?
you and they.
You and they, yeah. So the first one seems to be you. You're gonna be there, James, Peter, Andrew. You guys, you're gonna be there. This other part seems to be, well, maybe you're not going to be there because it's some other people that are gonna see it. It's they that will witness it. And what are they going to see is the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Those who witness these signs at the ends of the times are going to ultimately see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with signs of God of great glory. Now, clouds, just like in the Old Testament, when you have the clouds in the Exodus event and the pillar of cloud and all that, and when God appears in clouds in the Old Testament, it's both in some sense to conceal his glory, but also to reveal his glory. And it's the same thing here. The Son of Man, it's that there's the protection from his glory, but also it's a sign of the glory and the power that he has. So think about this. There's going to be all these wars, rumors of wars that generate false messiahs, but the true Messiah, the vindicated Son of Man, will yet come. So you're going to have false messiahs, but the true Messiah is going to come. And this is what Jesus has already predicted a couple different times at the end of chapter 8, in verse 9, chapter 9, verse 31, and chapter 10, 23. He talked about how the Son of Man will come in power and great glory. And the Son of Man and the clouds is all again referencing Daniel. This is images that come back to us from Daniel chapter 7. That's a passage that it deals with God's vindication of his people and his chosen ones. And so he has applied, Daniel talks about one like the Son of Man. And so Jesus uses that title, the Son of Man, to speak of himself. So he's the Son of Man who is the final judge and the vindicator, the one who brings the victory to all of his faithful ones, all the faithful ones. So this passage here about the coming of the Son of Man, it is really an assurance to Christians. It's to give them courage that no matter what suffering they might have to endure, their faithfulness to Jesus will be recognized. That on the last day, he's going to acknowledge them, and they're going to see him, and they're going to be gathered together. And so this is great encouragement to those that are undergoing suffering. In verse 27, he talks about sending out angels and gathering his elect from the four corners. So his chosen ones, his elect ones, his children. So this was another Old Testament kind of image. Isaiah and Zechariah and Ezekiel, all these prophets talk about how there's going to be a remnant that is gathered from the four corners of the earth. And in the Old Testament, they're brought back to Judea, to Jerusalem. But here Jesus gives us this image, and it's not the remnant is the language he uses, but the elect. We're not told exactly where they're going to be gathered, but they are going to be gathered from the four winds and from the ends of the earth and to the ends of heaven. Now that's very significant, because why would the four winds, what would that be referring to?
The four corners.
The four corners. So if you have the four corners of the earth, that means every nation, right? What did Jesus say earlier in the chapter? He said in verse 10? The good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. So the angels are going to go and gather people from all nations, from all the four corners of the earth. That this enterprise, this kingdom of Jesus is going to be a worldwide kingdom, and it is going to impact every nation on the earth. And that's what this is showing, is that before the Son of Man comes, that is fulfilled, that every nation has heard the good news. And so he will have children in every nation, and from all the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven, they will be called. So that takes for granted then that when the Son of Man comes, the gospel has been preached to all the nations. So this is what happens between the two comings of the Son of Man, the two comings. So we have the first coming that we're talking about here in Mark, and the cross and the resurrection. That's the first coming. The second coming, when he comes in great power and great glory. And what's happening in between? Mission. Unfortunately, it's not just mission, it's also persecution, but mission and persecution are the things that happen. And ultimately, then he has calls children from his chosen ones from all the four corners of the earth. Then Jesus continues with a lesson from the fig tree, and he likes using fig trees because we had the fig tree that was used earlier in reference to the temple. He seems to be making a different, there he was talking about the fig tree that did not yield fruit. But here, what is the point? What is he referring to about the fig tree? What does he draw our attention to?
Summer is near. He's talking about the
times.
seasons.
So yeah, it's the season. So what are the signs that you can tell that summer is near? So when you look at this fig tree, you'll see some signs. And the signs that he talks about are the branches become tender and they begin to sprout leaves. So when that starts happening, summer is approaching. Summer is near. And so he takes this example of the fig tree to say, just as you know, when you see those things happening, that summer is inevitable, summer is coming. So when you see these things, these signs happening, you're going to know that the end is coming, that Christ is appearing. It's going to be happening, that the Son of Man is at the gates, is the way he puts it there in verse 29. When those things, these signs that he talks about in 24 and 25 take place, you'll know. So then he says this other phrase that so reading the signs is a clear thing here. The question is, what is this? Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Well, that's interesting, because, well, as far as we know, that generation, Peter, James, Andrew, and John, they've kind of passed away. So how do we deal with that verse? Is this one you've ever tried to rectify?
Trying to memorize it as you read it.
Yeah. So it's a hard thing to know for sure what Jesus might be indicating with this, and scholars and Bible teachers continue to wrestle with this. But generation can mean what we typically think about, like this current generation. So we have the different generations, and in our time we have, Generation X and millennials and all these different generations. We could talk about it in that sense. And this present generation can also sometimes in Greek be used to talk about, in a more general sense, to the rule of the present evil authorities. Sometimes it can be used in that way. And that's another way that you could see it, that this generation, the rule, the way in which nations rule now will come to an end. That's another way that it could be, will be that evil will remain. The evil ruling nations will be part of the world until Christ comes, which is a message that we also see in other books of the Bible, like the book of Revelation. So it's possible that you could read it that way. I don't know for sure. The other thing in verse 31, then he picks up that word pass away. So he said that generation will not pass away, but here he says heaven and earth will ultimately pass away. So when he's talking about heaven and earth, here is the skies and the earth, that all of that's going to pass away, but my words will not pass away. So here he's talking again about that idea of Isaiah 40, when it talks about the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God will stand forever. Interesting that he says his word will stand forever. So he puts his words, Jesus's words, on par with the words of God, which is an indication of his divinity here. But that will pass away. Heaven and earth will ultimately be destroyed, but Jesus's words will come true. You can bank on it. So that's what he's really focusing on. And then the final paragraph here in verse 32 to the end of the chapter gets back to the question of when. And the focus on that is he opens this whole part by saying, well, no one knows that day or that hour. No one knows. In fact, he doesn't even know. The Son doesn't know, and the angels in heaven don't know. It's only the Father who knows. So he admits that he doesn't even know. So he doesn't know. What should then be the focus of disciples? What should they do?
Be on guard.
Be on guard. Yeah. So our action, our responsibility is to be on guard, to be alert. That's what he said. He's repeated that phrase in verse 33 of keep alert. We've seen that like 4 or 5 different times in this chapter. That's the posture that disciples are called to have is to always be alert. And there's this sense of urgency then, that since we don't know the time, that we always are prepared, that we always are ready for that time, because it can happen at any moment. And so we're told two things. We're told that it's going to happen. It could happen at any time. We don't know when, but that there is a certainty that it will happen. So that's the thing. There's the certainty that it will happen, but the uncertainty of when, which creates an urgency. So we have both an urgency and a certainty of the return. And so this is all part of God's plan of when it will ultimately take place. And watch. What does it mean to watch and to be alert? In this chapter, it's certainly talking about looking at the world and being discerning, being able to read the signs, not being swept away by false teaching and false messiahs. It's a call to watchfulness in this in-between time, in between Jesus's first coming and Jesus's second coming. And we're always called to be watchful. I would say that watchful also has to be with being faithful disciples, enduring, and going through carrying the cross, just as Jesus called us to do, and serving others. I think all of that is part of what it means to be watchful in the in-between time. And that's all part of how Mark calls us to live. Then Jesus uses a simile. Remember similes from school? Uses like or as, and that's what we have in verse 34. It is like, and we have this idea of a man going on a journey. So the man goes on a journey. He leaves his home. He puts the slaves in charge. This is a little similar to the parable that Jesus had told a few chapters back, but here he's making a different point, that he puts his slaves in charge, and he commands the doorkeeper to be on watch. So then he says in verse 35, again, keep awake. So you're seeing this idea, alertness, awakeness, because why? You don't know when the master of the house will come. So just like when that master leaves and goes on his little cruise and takes his vacation wherever he's going, we don't know, but you don't know when exactly he's going to return. You got to be ready. You got to be working. You got to be watchful. That's the idea that Jesus is making with this idea, and that this particularly the doorkeeper to be on watch. That's what we're called to do, is keep awake. Then it's interesting because in verse 35, Jesus says, you don't know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn. So there's these four different times that are mentioned here. These are the four different watches of the night. And the fact that the truth is that the master could return even in the night. And so that's why you have to be on guard even in the night, because being on guard at nighttime makes the call to perform your duty even more urgent, but also more difficult because it's harder to see. But you still have to keep on guard even at that time, because you never know when it will happen. But there's also this other thing, is that in these four watches of the night that is very interesting, is these that's the 4 hours, 4 watches of the night according to the Roman reckoning. Jesus's passion, and that we're going to see, takes place around these 4 watches of the night. Those 4 terms that are mentioned here are going to be the times in which significant events unfold in the passion narrative. Because you have the evening, that's when Jesus's final meal with the disciples takes place, and the Last Supper. You have then the middle of the night, and in the middle of the night, the arrest and all the garden and all that part will take place. The Jewish trial that takes place specifically at that time. And then at the cockcrow, what happens at the cockcrow? That's when Peter will deny him. So you have that, and then you have in the morning the trial before Pilate. So it's an interesting way that he's also foreshadowing here. And the other thing that it's pretty neat how Mark ties this in a sense to our eschatological, waiting for the final return of Jesus is tied to the disciples and their first at Jesus's first coming and their lack of watchfulness. Because what happens in the garden is Jesus is going to ask Peter and James and John specifically, they're going to be with him and he's going to say, watch. And what's he going to do? He's going to come and find them sleeping. They were unable to stay awake. And so at the end of this, he says, in verse 37, this isn't just for you guys, the 4 disciples he was talking about here. It's not just for the 12 disciples. It's for everybody. It's for all disciples are called to be watchful. That this is a command that all of us are to have. And that is kind of foreshadowing some of what's going to happen in the rest of this, the passion narrative as we go forth. If I could, summarize, we have the first half focused on the destruction of the temple, second half focused on the end of the world. How do we live in the in-between time, in between Christ's first coming and the second coming? We live as people of watchfulness, not concerned about when, but concerned about the fact that it will happen and focused on the mission of preaching the gospel to all nations. Jesus is not, the purpose of Jesus saying this and the purpose of Mark recording it is not esoteric information. It's not just so that we'll know and be able to speculate about when the end times are. That's not the point. The point is not to make us wonder, because certainly there's been enough people that have done that. Look how many cults have started because they've said, Jesus is going to come. I remember as a kid being really frightened at 88 reasons why Jesus will come back in 1988. But the thing is we don't know the time. We don't know the day or the hour. The point is that we are to be faithful and we are to be obedient in this in-between time. Even when there's distress, even when there's upheaval, what is certain is that there will be persecution. But what is also certain is that the mission will go forward. And Jesus then is encouraging us to be on guard and to live lives of faithfulness no matter what. Any thoughts or observations on any part of chapter 13, which I think is the hardest chapter in the Gospel of Mark?
You can read this. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jack.
You can read this passage as being very threatening. We need to be on guard. We need to be watchful. But you can also interpret it differently from verse 32. God is in charge. And as you said, we need to keep the faith. And all we need to do is be ready. And we're called upon when the time comes. I don't see it that threatening, to be that threatening.
Yeah. And I think normally we often get lost in the imagery and the threat of it all, that we lose sight of God's in charge and our role is to keep alert. And that's the essence of this whole thing. God knows, and we don't have to worry about it because we don't know. So that does get to, I think, the essence of what Jesus is saying. And I think he's preparing his disciples for these things and letting them know that when those kind of things happen, the persecution, the wars, all that stuff, that doesn't mean that he's not with them. It's all part of God's plan. And ultimately the mission will go forward and ultimately he will come back. Susan, were you gonna make a comment?
I had 2 things. One was just something that's personal to me, that it always strikes me that Jesus doesn't even know.
Yeah.
It's when God says, okay, the time has come, go now and get my children. And that just always blows my mind. Even when I read it over and over again, it's still just because, they're 3 in 1. And you think about the oneness, that surely that Christ and the Holy Spirit would know too, but the reality is no, because they are three individual persons, even though they are one in essence. So that's one. But the other thing is, I was wondering, in 26 and 27, when they talk about him coming on the clouds and sending his angels to gather the elect, my Bible doesn't say it, but is that a parallel to Revelation chapter 14, where it says, I looked and behold a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head golden crown and sharp sickle. And then he's told to go out and harvest time and reap the earth. And one is the good ones are collected in, and the other ones are just destroyed and thrown into the wine press. And I was wondering if that, as I say, I don't see that in terms of a reference, but
Yeah.
it sounds similar.
It is similar, and I think that is I was turning there, and you have the angels going out as well in that part. Mhm. So yeah, that could be, and I didn't have a parallel in anything that I had read there and in any thing in my notes, but what I like about that in 14 is what chapter 14 verse 12, then it's doing a similar thing, right? What is called for is the endurance of the saints to keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. That Revelation is doing a similar thing to what I think Mark and what Jesus are doing here, is that he's calling for watchfulness, perseverance, endurance in the midst of everything, that this is going to be coming. Jesus is going to be returning and bringing the harvest and sending out the angels. But yes, this is all going to be part of that. Yeah, because you have all those angels. Are there 4 in that one? I think it might be at least 4 there. But yeah, I think that would be possible parallel. And I think, with Revelation, this is probably the closest thing that we have to in the Gospels to kind of Revelation and kind of this apocalyptic type of literature, where you're looking at what the end times bring and what all that means and how we live in light of that. And so I think that would make sense, that there are some parallels, I think, to Revelation. Any other thoughts or observations?
I'm a little hesitant to speak up because I kind of read these prophecies, I think, different than a lot of people do. I don't know if anyone has ever agreed with my thinking, but let me just throw this question out to you. What's going to happen to every one of us that we don't know when it's going to happen?
I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Well,
you say that again,
What
please?
is each one of us going to experience? What's going to happen to each one of us that we don't know when it's going to happen?
Me, I would say that question. I always look at it on the good side. Let it happen when it happens. Each one of us will get accounted for.
So are you saying, what is our experience when whatever happens? Is that what you're kind of trying to ask?
Yeah. That's what I think he's saying.
No, that's not exactly it.
Not exactly. Yeah.
There's an event that we're all going to face. It's all coming to us one day, and we don't know when it's going to happen. So what do you think that is?
Well, it could be death or judgment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Death.
Yeah.
That's what I
And
think.
Jesus is calling us to be faithful servants right up to our death. And then we're going to depart this world as we know it and enter a spiritual world in a spiritual body.
Mhm.
Well, that's another way I was looking at it. Yeah. I teach the word of God to people that need it.
Yeah, I see what you're trying to get at. There is this idea that just as death is unknown when that will happen, being prepared, watchful in light of that. Is that what you're saying there?
Yes, we're to be faithful to our faith, faithful to the teachings of Christ, and just be a faithful servant using our gifts and talents for as long as we can till we die,
Mhm.
with the hope and the look and the forward lookingness of entering a spiritual world and a spiritual body where there's no more death, no
Mhm.
more pain.
Well, I see where you're going. Yeah, I've been doing that too. Even if I can't get out, I do it over the internet.
So yeah, I think, yeah, and I don't know anyone that, like you said, I don't know anyone that reads it exactly that way in this in this section. But I think the theme of watchfulness and being prepared would be the same, whichever way it happens, right? So whether it's death that we're being ready for, or the physical coming of Christ, or however we see that would be idea of preparedness is important. The truth is that one way or another, we're gonna have this moment where we come and have to be ready. So yeah, Susan, were you going to say something that looked like you might?
Nope.
I thought you
I was-
were having a good idea.
No, I was smiling at the cat.
Oh yes, so there you go.
Fine.
The cat appeared, so that was nice.
Porter's hit on something that troubles me too. And the idea is, given what I've been thinking about in terms of God is in charge, we need to be faithful and to be ready. But what does that mean? And it troubles me that I'm not sure what it means for me. Meaning, I think that all of us during our lives are called upon at some point by God. We don't know when, but we're called upon to give testimony, to stand up and be counted. And I don't know if that's happened to me yet. I'm not sure. We don't know. Some people I know have been dealing with it all through their lives. They've already been called and they are responding. And some of us don't know for sure yet whether we've had that calling. And it is troubling to me, Porter. I don't know, right? Whether it is death or whether it is simply to stand up and say, no, we will not do this. This is wrong, right? And so I don't know.
Well, that's where I get my hope from, that something better is coming. Try to be faithful, try to be a good servant, try to help other people right up till you can't do it anymore. And then when death occurs, if you've been that faithful servant, Christ is going to be faithful to you and help you enter into a spiritual world with him, spiritual relationship with him after death, after physical death.
Uh-huh.
Might I say, Jack, I think you did just testify.
I was gonna say also, you can help
I
one
don't think you heard that.
I don't think you heard that. I might be muted.
Well,
I heard you, bud.
Did you?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think you got some nods.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
And I think
Jack-
Jack's on mute, so
so I
he
think
didn't
he heard
directly
it.
respond. What's that, Susan?
And Jack was smiling, so I think he got it.
Yeah.
And I also think that being awake is being willing,
Willing.
being accepting. God offers, we must accept. And I think faith, trust, and obedience, the trust is accepting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's being, in that sense, the being alert and being awake is being ready. It is the being ready for the coming, but it is, I think, as Jack you have alluded to, and that comes a lot from the earlier part of this passage, but in verses 9 and so forth, when it says when you're going to appear before kings and governors and all this kind of stuff, that I'll give you the words and that you'll say. So I think there's also this sense of, but I think you're implying here that being ready is whenever and whatever situation that we're ready to whether that's testify or show our obedience and being faithful to God and showing our trust of Jesus in the midst of whatever situation. Sometimes that's going to be persecution. Sometimes that's going to be witnessing. Sometimes that's going to be enduring suffering in a way that testifies to the hope we have. So I think that that can be in many ways that comes.
Good.
But yeah, all that is alertness. And I think that's the point that this alertness that we'll see in the next part in the Garden of Gethsemane as well, that all takes place there. Good discussion and thoughts. Different and different interpretations are good. Do we have any anyone else that wants to say anything? And then I'll make a last comment.
You could also say it in this way, that where you help other people in need.
Yeah, I think that's a way to keep awake too, is service, because I think that's what Jesus was teaching in chapters 8, 9, and 10 in particular, that just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. That's part of our calling as well. So yeah, Keith, I think you're right. So last thing, and we're not going to go through that section tonight in chapter 14, but I want you to notice something in chapter 14. And we'll get there. This is a big turning point in the gospel, because we're coming to the passion narrative here. So that teaching leads to that. But notice that this passage, Mark 13, is framed by two women. So at the end of chapter 12, verses 41 and 44, we had that widow. And remember what she did? She gives everything she has. And she takes it and gives everything she has to the temple, which is a lost cause. Jesus shut it down, and he says it's going to be destroyed. Then in chapter 14, we have a woman, we'll study this next week, but this woman, we don't know who she is. She's unnamed. She comes and anoints Jesus's feet and gives an expensive gift to Jesus on his way to death. And Jesus specifically says she did all she could. A widow who does all she could, giving her money to the temple. And then this woman who does all she can for Jesus on his way to death. These are two temples. The Jerusalem temple and Jesus. And both these temples are headed for destruction. But Jesus is going to be raised from the dead as God's true temple. And the woman's act points to that as she's preparing him for his burial, but ultimately his resurrection, because it's ultimately pointing to the fact that he is king as well. So we'll unpack that as we go, but I think it's neat how chapter 13 is bracketed by these two women, and we're dealing with the temple, and here's Jesus and how he will be the one who ultimately. So what was the role of the temple? To provide the place where we meet God, where heaven and earth kind of meet. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that. He's the ultimate place where we come to meet God, and through his death on the cross and his resurrection, he's fulfilling the ultimate role of the temple.
Then it's interesting too that then when we get to Paul, where Paul says the temple is, it's in the heart of the believer.
Yeah, it's interesting how they all kind of use this temple imagery and do it in some different ways, and it all kind of connects. That temple is in some sense Christ, and then we become, as the body of Christ, the temple as well, and our bodies are a temple. So yeah, we'll unpack chapter 14, get into the passion narrative next week, so we'll look forward to that together.